The morning it all began. The cafeteria at Maplewood Elementary smelled the way it always did at 7:42 in the morning: powdered eggs, an industrial cleaner, and the particular sweetness of 2 ripe bananas going soft in a plastic bin near the serving counter. The radiators along the east wall knocked and hissed. The fluorescent tubes above the 3rd row of tables buzzed at a frequency that gave the custodian, Walter Grimes, a headache by 8:15 every single day without fail. He had mentioned it once to the assistant principal, a man named Dwayne Okafor, who wore bow ties and remembered every child's name, but forgot every maintenance request before he reached the end of the hallway. Walter had not mentioned it again. He was 61 years old, and he had learned a long time ago which battles were worth the energy and which ones you simply absorbed and moved through. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He was pushing his mop cart through the far end of the cafeteria that morning, working the gray tile in long, overlapping arcs the way he had learned to do it in the 31 years he had spent keeping other people's floors clean. First at the textile mill outside Greensboro, where he had started at 19. Then at 2 hospitals, 1 middle school, a county courthouse, and finally here at Maplewood Elementary in Clover Hill, North Carolina, where he had been for the past 11 years. He knew every square foot of this building. He knew which window in the gymnasium didn't latch properly after October and which toilet in the 3rd grade hallway ran if you didn't jiggle the handle. He knew the names of the plants in the front office. The 2 spider plants were named Gerald and Dolores by the secretary, Mrs. Patricia Timms, who had worked there almost as long as Walter had and who always left a covered plate for him when there were birthday treats in the staff room. He knew the sound the building made at 6:15 in the morning when he arrived and at 4:30 in the afternoon when he was the last one left, turning off lights room by room down the long corridors. He knew it so well he could feel when something in it had changed, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. What he did not expect on this particular Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of October was the child. She was sitting at the far end of table 7, which was unusual because table 7 was not a breakfast table. The breakfast children sat at tables 1 through 4, near the serving station, where the morning monitors could watch them without walking. Table 7 was where the 3rd graders sat for lunch, tucked back near the wall, and at 7:42 in the morning it should have been empty. Walter noticed her the way you notice something that is quiet and still in a place where things are usually moving. A small girl, maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. Dark brown skin and hair in 2 careful braids that someone had put in with patience and a fine-toothed comb. She was wearing a yellow cardigan over a white school shirt, and she had her lunch box on the table in front of her, a purple one with a cartoon dog on the front, and she was looking at the empty seat beside her with the particular focused attention of someone waiting for something specific. Walter stopped his cart. He looked around the cafeteria. The breakfast crowd was at the other end, 30 or 40 children eating and talking and spilling things. The monitors were near the serving station. Nobody was paying attention to table 7. He went back to mopping. At 7:51, when he pushed his cart past table 7 again on his return sweep, the girl was still there. The seat beside her was still empty. She was not eating. She had not opened her lunch box. She was just sitting with her hands folded on the table, looking at that empty seat, and Walter could not have explained exactly why, but something about the way she was sitting made him slow down. He was not a man who inserted himself into situations. He was a man who moved through the edges of other people's days and kept things clean and did not expect much in return for it. This was not bitterness. He had made his peace with the particular invisibility of service work long ago. The way people looked through you like glass when your uniform was gray and your cart smelled like bleach. He had a daughter, Renata, who was 34 and taught 4th grade in Asheville, and he had a younger brother named Curtis who lived in Durham and called every Sunday, and he had a garden at the back of his house on Sycamore Street where he grew tomatoes and peppers and the particular variety of collard greens his mother had grown before him. He had enough. He did not need to be seen. But this child was waiting for someone, and whoever that someone was had not come, and there was something about her patience, the absolute stillness of it, the way she wasn't sad exactly but wasn't quite all right either, that made Walter set the brake on his cart and walk over. He stopped a few feet from the table. He was aware that he was a large man, broad through the shoulders, and that children he did not know sometimes startled at his sudden closeness. He kept his distance. "Hey there," he said. "You waiting on somebody?" The girl looked up. She had dark eyes, wide and serious, and when she saw him, she did not startle. She looked at him the way children look at things they have decided to think carefully about before responding. Then she said, "I was saving this seat for you." Walter blinked. He was not entirely sure he had heard correctly. "For me?" She nodded. "I see you eat your lunch over by the loading dock by yourself," she said. "I saw you yesterday and the day before." She tilted her head slightly. "That doesn't seem very nice. So I saved you a seat." Walter stood with his mop handle still in one hand and looked at this child who had, apparently, noticed something that no adult in this building had thought to notice in 11 years, which was that Walter Grimes ate his lunch alone beside a loading dock and that this was perhaps not the way a person ought to spend the middle of his day. He didn't know what to say. He was a man who knew what to say in most situations. He had raised himself on practicality and directness and the kind of plain-spoken warmth that came from a family where you said what you meant and meant what you said. But this child had disarmed him completely. He felt something shift in his chest, something quiet and unfamiliar. "What's your name?" he said. "Lily," she said. "Lily Osei." "What's yours?" "Walter," he said. "Walter Grimes." She considered this. "You can sit down, Walter, if you want." He looked at the seat she had saved. He looked at the monitors at the other end of the cafeteria who were still not paying attention to table 7. He looked at this small, serious girl in the yellow cardigan who had arrived early and waited and saved him a seat because she thought eating alone by a loading dock didn't seem very nice. He sat down. He did not eat. It was nearly 8 in the morning and his lunch break was not for another 4 hours. But he sat, and Lily opened her lunchbox and took out a small bag of crackers and pushed them toward the center of the table in the easy, automatic way of someone who has grown up being taught to share, and they sat together at table 7 while the cafeteria noise rose and fell around them and the radiators knocked and the fluorescent tube above row 3 buzzed its low, persistent buzz, and somehow, for the 11 minutes before the first bell rang, none of that bothered Walter at all. He learned the following things about Lily Osei in those 11 minutes. She was in 2nd grade, Mrs. Abernathy's class, room 14. She was 7 years old. Her favorite animal was the red panda, which she described as embarrassingly cute and also surprisingly fierce. She had a father named James who was a nurse at Clover Hill Regional and worked night shifts 3 times a week. She had a grandmother named Nana Addie who picked her up from school on the days her father slept. She had strong opinions about the cafeteria pizza, which she described as rubber with sauce, and about the condition of the pencil sharpener in the 3rd grade hallway, which she said was practically criminal. She delivered all of this in a tone of measured but genuine concern, the way a very small senator might deliver a report on matters of public interest. Walter told her that he agreed about the pizza, that he would add the pencil sharpener to his repair list, and that he had once seen a red panda at the zoo in Charlotte and she was right about all of it. The bell rang. Lily slid off the bench and picked up her lunchbox and her backpack. She looked at him with the same careful, serious expression she'd worn when she'd told him she'd saved him the seat. "Same time tomorrow?" she said. Walter looked at her. He should have said something practical. He should have said children are supposed to sit with their classes, or he would be working at the other end of the building tomorrow morning, or something that managed expectations. Instead he said, "Same time tomorrow." She nodded once, satisfied, and walked away toward the hallway. Walter sat at table 7 for another moment after she was gone. Then he went back to his cart, released the brake, and finished mopping the cafeteria floor with the particular thoroughness of a man who had decided to pay close attention to something for the first time in a while without quite knowing why. The Osei family had moved to Clover Hill 14 months before the morning Lily saved Walter a seat. They had come from Charlotte, where James Osei had worked in the cardiac unit at Atrium Health for 6 years and where Lily had been born at the same hospital on a bright March morning in the middle of a rainstorm that James still described as the loudest sound he had ever heard. He was a quiet man himself, deliberate and careful, the kind of person who thought through what he wanted to say before he said it and who expressed love through specific, steady action rather than through proclamation. He had grown up in Kumasi, Ghana, the second of 4 children, the son of a schoolteacher and an accountant who had believed with absolute conviction that education was the lever that moved the world. He had come to the United States at 22 on an academic scholarship, completed his nursing degree in 3 years, and worked every shift available to him in the first 5 years of his career because he understood in a way that was not abstract but deeply personal what it meant to build something from the ground up on a foundation that was not guaranteed. He had married Angela Webb in the spring of his 5th year in Charlotte. Angela was a landscape architect who laughed easily and loudly and who had a talent for making any space feel like somewhere worth being. She had died of a cardiac arrhythmia, sudden, undetected, devastating, when Lily was 3 years old. She was 31. James had kept going the way people keep going when they have a small child and no other option. He had called his mother in Kumasi, who had flown in for 6 weeks and kept the house running while James went back to work earlier than he should have because staying home was harder. He had made Lily's world as stable as he possibly could: consistent routines, consistent meals, consistent love, the same books read in the same order on the same nights of the week, the rituals of constancy that children need when something enormous has shifted beneath them. His own mother had eventually gone home. His mother-in-law, Addie Webb, who had retired from 30 years of teaching elementary school and who lived 40 minutes outside Charlotte in a town called Breezy Pines, had started coming twice a week, then 3 times, then had eventually, with the quiet determination of a woman who has decided something and sees no point in announcing it, simply relocated herself to a small apartment 12 minutes from James and Lily's house in the East Charlotte neighborhood where they lived. Addie Webb was 67 years old and had the energy of someone 30 years younger and the patience of someone who had spent 3 decades in a classroom managing 25 children at once. She was short and brown and wore her silver hair natural, and she had opinions about everything: nutrition, city planning, the proper way to iron a collar, the moral implications of self-checkout lanes at grocery stores, and she shared these opinions freely and without apology because she had reached an age, she said, where there was simply no longer time to be polite about things that mattered. She adored Lily with a ferocity that was almost physical. She picked her up from school on the days James slept after a night shift, made her snacks that were both nutritious and genuinely good, and sat with her at the kitchen table while she did homework, offering help only when asked and not a moment before, which she said was the whole secret of teaching. When James decided to take the position at Clover Hill Regional, a senior nursing role that came with better hours and a significant enough salary increase to matter, Addie had said, without hesitation, "I'm coming too." James had started to say it wasn't necessary. Addie had looked at him over the rim of her glasses with the specific expression that meant the conversation was already over, and she was simply waiting for him to catch up. He'd found her an apartment 6 minutes from their new house on the far east side of Clover Hill before he'd officially accepted the offer. The new house was on a quiet street. It had a small backyard with an old peach tree that Lily had named Gerald II on the grounds that all distinguished trees deserved a distinguished name. The neighborhood was calm and a little unfamiliar, and Lily had started 2nd grade at Maplewood Elementary at the beginning of September, 3 weeks after they arrived, in a class where every child already had established friendships and inside jokes and a settled sense of where they belonged, and Lily, who was careful and observant and genuinely kind, had found herself in the particular loneliness of the new child who does not yet know the rules of the new place. She had not complained about this to James. She told him every evening about her day in the factual, repertorial way that was natural to her, and she had mentioned once that lunch was a little noisy and that she didn't always know where to sit, but she'd said it the way she said most things, as information, not as a request. James had made a note of it and had spoken to Mrs. Abernathy, who had been kind and attentive and who had made efforts to include Lily in group activities, and things had been improving slowly, the way things improve for a careful child in a new place when she is given enough time and enough steadiness. But it was not a conversation with Mrs. Abernathy or a structured group activity that had shifted things for Lily. It was the custodian eating alone by the loading dock. She had been coming into the cafeteria early since the 2nd week of school, arriving with the breakfast children, though she did not eat the school breakfast, preferring instead the lunch Addie packed, because the cafeteria was warm and the hallways before the first bell were loud in a way that made it hard to think. She had noticed Walter on a Wednesday, noticed the way she noticed most things, which was thoroughly and without calling attention to it. He had been sitting on an overturned crate beside the loading dock door at the far end of the east corridor, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback, and there had been something in the way he was sitting that was not sad and was not fine either. It was the particular quality of someone who has accepted a situation as simply the way things are, without ever having decided that it should be. Lily Osei was 7 years old, and she had grown up in a household where her father went to work every day and cared for people who were frightened and sick and far from home, and where her grandmother had spent 30 years making sure children felt seen and worth something, and she had absorbed from both of them, in the way children absorb the most important things, not through instruction but through daily proximity to people who lived it. She had absorbed the knowledge that noticing someone who was being overlooked and doing something about it was simply what you did. It was not exceptional. It was just correct. So she had saved him a seat. By the end of the first week, the 742 Table 7 arrangement had become, without either of them explicitly agreeing to it, a routine. Lily arrived first and set her lunch box on the table and sat with her hands folded and waited. Walter arrived between 7:44 and 7:48, depending on whether the floor near the gymnasium doors needed an extra pass, and he sat down and they talked for 9 to 14 minutes before the bell. He learned that she was working on a project about migratory birds for science class and that she found it genuinely interesting but thought the worksheets were badly designed. She learned that he grew tomatoes and that the best ones were the Cherokee purples and that growing something from seed was a completely different experience from buying a plant. He told her about his daughter Renata, who he called Nay, and about how Renata had his mother's hands and his father's stubbornness and had somehow turned both into assets. Lily told him about Nana Addie, who she said knew everything about everything except technology and was proudly uninterested in learning. Walter laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and Lily smiled at the sound of it, satisfied. The other children in the cafeteria noticed. Children notice most things, and they have a particular sensitivity to anything that disrupts the established order of their world. A custodian sitting with a student at table 7 was unusual enough to register. Most of them simply absorbed it and moved on. A few of the older children made comments, nothing cruel, just the reflexive commentary of kids encountering something that didn't fit their categories. Mrs. Timms, the secretary, noticed on the third morning and mentioned it to Walter in the hallway afterward with the warmth of someone who finds a small thing genuinely moving. Walter said Lily was good company. Mrs. Timms said she absolutely was and that her father was a lovely man and left it at that. The assistant principal, Mr. Okafor, noticed on the 6th morning and said nothing, which Walter appreciated more than he would have appreciated any comment, positive or negative. What neither Walter nor Lily knew was that someone else had noticed too, and that this someone had been watching not just the cafeteria but the whole school for a reason that had nothing to do with any of them. His name was Elliot Marsh. He was 43 years old, and he was the CEO of Marsh Education Group, the private investment company that had purchased the Clover Hill School District's partnership management contract 18 months ago, bringing with it a significant capital infusion, a consulting arrangement with the district's operations team, and Elliot himself, who had made a habit since founding the company 12 years ago of personally visiting every facility in his portfolio at least once per quarter. He did not announce these visits. He had learned what his own mother, a woman named Clara Marsh who had managed the cafeteria at a public school in Winston-Salem for 22 years, had taught him early, that the truth of any place lived in its ordinary mornings when no one was performing for an audience. He had been coming to Maplewood for 3 mornings now, sitting in different spots each time, once in the cafeteria, once in the main office waiting area under the guise of reviewing paperwork, once standing in the parking lot during arrival time with a coffee thermos and a clipboard that made him look like he was conducting an assessment, which in a sense he was. He had a sharp eye for operational details. He had built his company on the conviction that you could tell everything about an institution's culture by watching how its lowest compensated employees were treated and how they in turn treated the people they served. He had seen good places and broken ones, and he knew within about 40 minutes which one he was in. Maplewood, he had decided on his first morning, was a good place that had not been fully seen. There were things here worth keeping and building on, and there were things that had been overlooked for so long they had started to calcify into permanent problems. The morale among the support staff was low. He could read it in the particular quality of the morning interactions, the way the monitors talked to each other and not to the children, the way the custodial staff moved through the building with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned not to expect to be included. Except for the custodian at table 7. Elliot had noticed Walter on his first morning in the cafeteria. He had noticed the mop work first, the long, overlapping arcs of someone who had been doing this long enough to know exactly the most efficient pattern, and then he had noticed the child, and then he had noticed the quality of what was happening between them. He had a good ear for conversations. He could not hear what they were saying from where he sat, but he could read the shape of it, the child's serious attention, the old man's initial uncertainty giving way to something relaxed and genuine, the crackers pushed to the center of the table, the laughter that was real rather than polite. He had watched the bell ring and the child say something and Walter nod, and he had thought, there is something in that I should understand before I make any decisions about this building. He had come back the next morning and the morning after that. By the third morning, he had asked Mrs. Timms, carefully and without revealing exactly why he was asking, who the custodian was who worked the cafeteria mornings. Mrs. Timms had told him Walter Grimes, here 11 years, reliable as sunrise, the best thing that ever happened to the gymnasium floor. She had said the last part with the pride of someone who considers floor quality an appropriate measure of institutional integrity. Elliot had written the name down. He had also, on his second morning, overheard a conversation he had not been meant to hear. It had happened in the hallway just outside the cafeteria entrance, between two members of the administrative staff whose names he did not yet know. They were discussing the upcoming budget review, specifically the support staff contracts, which were being reevaluated as part of the district's cost restructuring. One of them had said, with the breezy certainty of someone who considers a decision already made, that the custodial contracts would likely be consolidated and renegotiated, which in the language of institutional budget restructuring meant that some people would lose their positions and others would see their wages reduced and the remaining staff would absorb the difference in workload without additional compensation. Walter Grimes had been mentioned by name. The phrase used was long-tenured, which meant expensive relative to a newer hire, and the tone was the tone of someone calculating where the cuts would be least visible rather than where they would do the least harm. Elliot had stood in the hallway with his coffee thermos and his clipboard and listened to this conversation and had kept his face neutral. He was good at keeping his face neutral. He had learned it in a different kind of hallway, the one outside the hospital room where his mother had spent the last 4 months of her life, where he had perfected the particular stillness of a person who is absorbing something enormous and refusing to let it show until the moment when showing it is actually useful. That morning, watching Walter sit with Lily at table 7, listening to the shape of their conversation without hearing the words, Elliot Marsh had made a decision. Not immediately. He was not a man who moved on instinct alone. He had built everything he had built on the combination of instinct and evidence, and the evidence was still assembling itself. But the decision, in its broad outline, had already arrived. He was going to understand Walter Grimes before anyone renegotiated anything. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first time Walter met Elliot Marsh, he did not know who Elliot was. This was deliberate on Elliot's part. He had introduced himself simply as Elliot, visiting the facility on behalf of the district's operations review, which was technically accurate and revealed approximately nothing. He had caught Walter in the east corridor after the morning cafeteria rush, when Walter was doing a second pass on the floor near the gymnasium, and he had said, "Excuse me, I don't want to interrupt your work, but I wondered if I could ask you a few questions about the building." Walter had looked at him with the measuring assessment of a man who has dealt with administrators his entire working life and has become expert at distinguishing between the ones who actually want information and the ones who want to perform the act of gathering information. He had decided this one probably actually wanted information. He said, "Go ahead." Elliot had asked practical questions at first. How long had the gymnasium window issue been going on? What was the timeline on the reported plumbing concerns in the third-grade hallway? What was Walter's read on the morning arrival flow, the choke point near the main entrance where two classes always ended up stacked against each other? Walter answered all of this directly and specifically and without editorializing. He was not a man who complained. He was a man who described situations and proposed solutions, and that was what he did here. Here is what is happening, here is what I think should be done about it, here is how long it would take and what it would cost. Elliot listened to all of it. Then he said, "The girl you sit with in the mornings." "Lily," Walter said. "Lily Osei. She's in Mrs. Abernathy's class. 2nd grade. She new to the school? Started in September." Elliot nodded. "She sought you out?" Walter looked at him. "She saved me a seat," he said. Elliot was quiet for a moment. He said, "Why?" Walter set his mop handle against the wall and looked at this man who was asking him questions with a quality of attention that felt different from the questions that preceded it. Because she saw me eating alone by the loading dock and she thought that didn't seem right, Walter said. And she decided to do something about it. Elliot held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "She's right," and it didn't sound like pleasantry. It sounded like a conclusion arrived at after consideration. Walter picked up his mop handle. "What is this review actually about?" he asked, because he was 61 years old and he had been in enough buildings for long enough to know when something was coming that people were not yet saying out loud. Elliot looked at him for a moment. "Budget restructuring," he said. "Contract review. I'm trying to understand what's actually here before decisions get made." Walter absorbed this. He said, "All right," and went back to mopping. He did not think about it excessively that day. He was not a man given to excessive thinking about things he could not control. He worked the rest of his shift with his usual thoroughness: the gymnasium, the third-grade hallway, the staff bathrooms, the narrow corridor behind the kitchen that nobody thought about until it became a problem. He fixed the pencil sharpener in the third-grade hallway, which he had added to his list the morning Lily mentioned it, and which turned out to require a small internal mechanism replacement that he ordered himself and paid for with his own $3.40 because the supply requisition process for items under $10 was more complicated than it was worth, and he had learned simply to absorb small costs rather than perform the bureaucracy required to recover them. He ate his lunch, because it was Wednesday and he had leftover rice and stewed chicken in the container his brother Curtis's wife Della had sent home with him at Sunday dinner, at table 7. The cafeteria was full of lunchtime children and noise and the particular organized chaos of 400 elementary students cycling through in 3 shifts, and at the far end of table 7, 2 seats down from where he always sat, someone had left a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a drawing, crayon on wide-ruled notebook paper, a mop, a table, 2 figures sitting across from each other, one tall and one small, and above them, in careful second-grade print, Walter and Lily's table. A star had been drawn in each corner. It was a very good star, each one 5-pointed and roughly symmetrical, which was not nothing for 7 years old. He folded the drawing and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. He had not had something to put in a breast pocket in a long time. That evening, at his house on Sycamore Street, he called Renata. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the warm distraction of someone managing dinner and a conversation simultaneously, and he told her about Lily the way he told Renata most things, simply and without embellishment, and there was a silence on her end that he recognized as his daughter absorbing something. Then she said, "Daddy," and there was something in the word that was not exactly worried and not exactly relieved, but something between those things. The emotion of a child who has spent years watching her father be fine and has learned to read the specific quality of his fineness. She said, "Is she all right? Is the family all right?" He said, as far as he could tell. "Single dad, night shift nurse, grandmother nearby." "Good people," he said, because he had learned enough in 11 days to know that much. Renata said, "What's she like?" "Serious," he said. "Smart. She's got opinions about the cafeteria pizza, and she is correct about all of them. She noticed something that grown people walk past every day, and she decided to do something about it." He paused. "She's something, nay." Renata was quiet again. Then she said, "I'm glad you told her yes." Walter looked out the kitchen window at his garden, where the last of the season's tomatoes were still holding on, deep and dark in the October evening light. "I didn't have much of a choice," he said. "She was sitting there waiting." Renata laughed. "That sounds about right," she said. He did not tell Renata about the man named Elliot or the budget review or the phrase long-tenured, which meant expensive, and which he had understood perfectly when the word arrived to him through the particular grapevine of support staff who knew each other and heard things and did not always share them upward but shared them horizontally, which was more reliable anyway. He had heard it from the building's other custodian, a man named Pete Garrido, who had been there 4 years, and who said it with the flat pragmatic fatalism of someone who has been through a restructuring before and knows how they tend to go. Walter had said, "All right," and meant it, not as acceptance of something wrong, but as acknowledgement of a fact. He was 61 years old. He had a pension, modest but real, that would vest fully in 2 years if he stayed, and he had the house on Sycamore Street that was paid off, and the garden and Curtis and Renata and Sunday dinners at Della's, and he had built a life of such specific and careful sufficiency that there was very little in it that could be taken from him without his active participation. What he had not expected was that any of it would be relevant to a 7-year-old in a yellow cardigan who had decided that no one should eat alone. James Osei met Walter Grimes on the third Thursday in October, which was the day of Maplewood's fall family engagement evening. An event that the district had rebranded 3 times in the past 5 years in an attempt to get more parents to attend without addressing the actual reasons they didn't, which was that it was held on a Thursday at 6:30 and most working parents of elementary-age children were managing dinner and bedtimes and the specific exhaustion of a Thursday in mid-October, and could not summon enthusiasm for an additional hour and a half in a school gymnasium. James was there because Lily had asked him to come. She had asked him on Monday, in the particular tone she used when something mattered, but she was not going to say it mattered outright. She had said there was a thing on Thursday and she thought it would be interesting. He had looked at her over his coffee cup and she had looked back at him with her mother's direct, steady gaze, and he had said, "I'll be there." He had asked Addie to come too, and Addie had said obviously and arrived in her good coat. They found Lily's classroom display in the main corridor and then followed Lily, who was navigating with the purposeful confidence of a tour guide, to the cafeteria, where some of the school staff had set up tables with information about programs and resources. And that was where Lily had led them, directly and without hesitation, to the far end of the room, where Walter Grimes was standing near a display about the school's maintenance and facilities program, a display that, it was clear, had been set up by someone in the district office rather than by Walter, who was standing beside it with the slightly resigned expression of a man who had been told to be there and was doing his best with the situation. "Walter," Lily said, "this is my dad and this is Nana Addie." Walter looked up. He saw James first, a man close to his own height, lean and precise in his movements, with the quality of measured attentiveness that Walter had come to associate with people who worked in healthcare, who had learned to be fully present to situations without being undone by them. And then Addie, small and silver-haired and already looking at Walter with the kind of direct, assessing warmth of someone who has heard things about him and is deciding whether they match. James extended his hand. "Mr. Grimes," he said, "Lily has told us quite a bit about you." Walter shook it. "She's told me quite a bit about you too," he said. Addie was already pulling out one of the chairs near the table. "Sit down," she said, not as a suggestion. "I want to hear about the tomatoes. Lily said you grow Cherokee purples and I have been trying to get a reliable crop of those for 6 years and something keeps going wrong in August." Walter sat down. Addie sat across from him. James pulled up a chair for himself and one for Lily, who climbed up and arranged herself with her lunchbox still present, because she had brought it for reasons that remained her own, and the 4 of them sat together in the corner of the gymnasium cafeteria while the fall family engagement evening moved around them, and Walter talked about Cherokee purples with the unguarded enthusiasm of a man who almost never gets to talk about the thing he loves most, and Addie listened with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely learning something, and James watched his daughter watching Walter with an expression of quiet, watchful recognition. Later, when Lily had been absorbed into the display table browsing with 2 girls from her class who had appeared and pulled her along, James and Walter had a different kind of conversation. James asked the practical question first. "How long have you been here?" 11 years, Walter said. "And before that?" And Walter gave the short version: the mill, the hospitals, the courthouse, the schools. James nodded. He was the kind of man who received information without editorializing it, and Walter appreciated this. They talked about the school, about what worked and what didn't, about Lily's adjustment, about how she was doing with the lunch situation, which James had been aware of and quietly concerned about. Walter said she was doing better. "She's finding her ground," he said. "She just needed somewhere to put down an anchor first." James looked at him. "She found that at your table," he said. Walter looked at where Lily was standing now, animated and gesturing at something in the display, the 2 new girls on either side of her, all 3 of them laughing about something. He said, "I think she didn't need much. She just needed a place that felt like hers." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You ate alone every day for how long?" Walter considered this. 11 years, he said, "give or take." James didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at Walter with the particular quality of attention of a man who is putting something away to think about more carefully later. Then he said, "I'm glad she noticed." Walter said, "So am I." Elliot Marsh was also at the fall family engagement evening. He had not announced his presence. He sat in the back row of chairs near the gymnasium entrance with his clipboard. He had decided the clipboard was effective cover, and he was not above effective cover, and he watched the room. He saw the facility's display table. He saw Walter Grimes sitting with a family he clearly knew. He watched the conversation, the way Addie was leaning and asking questions, the way James sat with that careful attentiveness, the way the little girl, Lily, he now knew glowed with the particular pleasure of someone who has brought two worlds together and found that they fit. He sat with his clipboard and watched the room and thought about his mother, Clara Marsh, who had managed the cafeteria at Jefferson Elementary in Winston-Salem for 22 years, and who had known the name of every child who came through her line and their allergies and their particular preferences, and who was having a hard week at home and who needed an extra roll without asking. She had been the institutional memory of that school in a way that never appeared in any organizational chart. When she retired, 3 things fell apart within the first semester that she had been quietly maintaining by hand for years, because no one had thought to ask her what she actually did or to document any of it or to value it in any concrete way before she was gone. He had built Marsh Education Group because of his mother. Not as a tribute, or not only as a tribute, but as a correction. As his attempt to build institutions that were structured around the understanding that the people who cleaned the floors and managed the cafeteria and kept the building running were not peripheral to the school's function, they were the foundation it stood on. He had not always succeeded. He knew that. He had made mistakes, hired the wrong people, trusted the wrong numbers, let budget conversations go in directions they should not have gone. The current contract review at Clover Hill was a case in point. He had allowed people on his operations team to advance a cost restructuring proposal without interrogating the human cost of it closely enough. The spreadsheet made sense. The spreadsheet almost always made sense. That was the problem with spreadsheets. He watched Walter laugh at something Addie had said. He watched Lily look up from across the room, catch Walter's eye, and break into a smile that was unguarded and completely real. He put the clipboard down. He had seen enough. The budget meeting was held on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of October, in the district's administrative offices on the 2nd floor of the Clover Hill Municipal Building, a room with drop ceilings and a long conference table that had seen too many of these conversations to be neutral about any of them. Elliot sat at one end. Across from him were 3 members of his operations team, his director of facilities contracts, a man named Greg Paulson who had an MBA from Duke and the particular confidence of someone who had learned to trust models more than people, and 2 analysts whose names Elliot kept straight because he made it a discipline to keep people's names straight even when their roles made them interchangeable in the way that certain roles did. There was also a representative from the district's administrative office, a woman named Sandra Fielding, deputy superintendent for operations, who had been in that role for 6 years and who had the slightly weathered competence of someone who had managed too many transitions with too few resources and had made her peace with doing more with less because the alternative was not doing it at all. Paulson opened with the numbers, which was his way of opening everything, and the numbers were what they were. The support staff contracts across the district's 12 facilities were the largest variable cost in the operational budget. The restructuring proposal recommended consolidation, reducing custodial staff at 6 locations by approximately 30%, renegotiating hourly rates at the remaining positions, and absorbing the differential through adjusted workload distributions. The projected savings were significant. The slide said significant. Elliot had read the slide 3 times before this meeting, and each time the word significant had bothered him in a way he could not immediately quantify. "Who takes the cut at Maplewood?" he said. Paulson pulled up a secondary slide. "The recommended reduction there is 1 full-time position. Walter Grimes is the senior staff member at that location and therefore the highest compensated. The cost differential between his rate and a new hire at entry level is substantial over a 3-year horizon." Elliot looked at the slide. He said, "What does Walter Grimes actually do at that building?" Paulson looked at him with the mild surprise of someone who did not expect that question from that direction. "He manages custodial operations for the full facility. Standard scope, floors, bathrooms, common areas, maintenance requests." Elliot said, "Does the model account for what he manages that isn't in the scope description?" A pause. Paulson said, "The scope description is comprehensive." Elliot said, "The gymnasium has a window that doesn't latch properly after October. He has been compensating for it every morning since October 1st by wedging it with a piece of foam. He cut himself because the work order for the replacement hardware has been in the low priority queue for 8 months. If he leaves, That window becomes a facility's liability before the first frost. He looked at Paulson. Is that in the scope description? Paulson said, that specific item, the pencil sharpener in the third-grade hallway, required an internal mechanism replacement. He ordered the part himself for $3.40 because the supply requisition process for items under $10 requires more administrative time than the item costs. He absorbed the expense personally. If he leaves, that sharpener goes unrepaired because no one else is tracking it. Elliot kept his voice level. What is the cost of a classroom that cannot sharpen pencils for 3 weeks while a work order moves through the queue? Sandra Fielding looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He continued, the morning arrival choke point near the main entrance has been managed for 11 years through a specific floor routing pattern he established and maintains. It is not written down anywhere. It exists because he knows the building well enough to have solved the problem without being asked. If he leaves, that problem returns. How much is that worth in the model? Paulson said, Mr. Marsh, these are qualitative factors, they are operational factors. Elliot said, they simply haven't been quantified because no one asked the person who knows them to document them. He closed the proposal folder. I'm not approving the Maplewood reduction. The rest of the restructuring we can continue to evaluate. But I want a different methodology for assessing essential staff. Not tenure as a cost proxy. Actual operational contribution. He looked at Paulson. Build that model and bring it back in 3 weeks. The meeting ended. Sandra Fielding caught up with him in the hallway. She said, that was a different conversation than I expected. Elliot said, what were you expecting? The usual, she said. Numbers, approvals, implementation timeline. She paused. What changed? He thought about the right way to answer that. He said, I went and looked at the building first. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, more people should do that. He said, I know. Walter did not know about the meeting. He did not know about the model or the proposal or the phrase long-tenured used as a synonym for expendable. What he knew was that the second week of November arrived with the first real cold of the season, the kind that came off the Blue Ridge with a particular authority that said summer was finished and was not interested in negotiating about it, and that Lily appeared at table 7 on the first Monday of that week wearing a heavier coat and carrying a thermos that turned out to contain hot chocolate that Nana Addie had made, and that she pushed the thermos toward the center of the table and said, Addie says it's the real kind, not the packet kind, and that there's enough for 2. Walter wrapped both hands around the thermos cup she poured for him and felt the warmth move through his palms and thought that there were worse ways to begin a Monday in November than this. She had a question that morning. She asked it the way she asked most serious questions, which was after a few minutes of regular conversation, when the ground had been established. She said, Walter, do you like it here? At this school? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he said. I do. Why? She was quiet for a moment, arranging her crackers in a row on the table. She said, Pete said something to Ms. Timms in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard him say that things might change, that some people might have to go. She looked up. Are you going to have to go? Walter looked at her. She was 7 years old and she had heard something in a hallway and she was asking him directly because that was how she operated, and he respected it too much to deflect. He said, I don't know yet. Sometimes people make decisions about buildings like this and the people who work in them. I'd know before anything happened. She looked at him with her mother's steadiness. Do you want to stay? He said, yes, I want to stay. She nodded once. Then she pushed the crackers to the center of the table. Then we should make sure the right people know that, she said, with the practical authority of a child who has grown up around a grandmother who believed that the correct response to a problem was to address it directly and without drama. Walter almost smiled. He said, it's a little more complicated than that, Lily. She said, most things that seem complicated are just things that nobody has said out loud yet. He looked at her. She had already gone back to the thermos. More? She said. He held out the cup. It was Addie Webb who brought the next piece into motion, which was appropriate because Addie had a gift for identifying the precise moment when observation needed to become action and for moving into that moment without hesitation. She had spent 30 years teaching second grade, which meant she had spent 30 years reading rooms and children and situations with the particular accuracy of someone who could not afford to get it wrong, because in a classroom of 25 7-year-olds, The cost of misreading a situation was immediate and non-negotiable. She had been listening to Lily talk about Walter since the second week of October. She had listened the way she listened to everything Lily said, which was fully and without interruption and with the part of her attention that she kept specifically reserved for the things that were being communicated underneath the things being said. She had met Walter at the family engagement evening and had made her own assessment, which she did not share with anyone immediately because she had learned that preliminary assessments were more useful if they were allowed to settle before being spoken. What she had assessed was this: Walter Grimes was a man of exceptional competence and no self-promotion whatsoever. He was the kind of person that institutions depended on invisibly, taking him entirely for granted until the moment he was gone, at which point they discovered, too late, what they had been resting on. She had known 3 people like this in her teaching career, all of them women, all of them eventually let go in budget adjustments, and in every case the adjustment had turned out to cost more than it saved once you counted what had quietly stopped working. She had also assessed James, which she had been doing with a mother-in-law's eye since the moment she had moved to Charlotte to be near him and Lily. James was a good man in the deepest sense, steady and loving and utterly reliable, and his one consistent limitation was that he tended to trust that things would work out as long as he did his own part correctly. He had inherited this from his father, who was an admirable man and wrong about this specific thing. Addie had never said so directly because it was not a conversation that could be won through argument. It could only be demonstrated, which was what life tended to do eventually anyway. But sometimes life needed help moving faster. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, Addie came for dinner at James and Lily's house on the quiet street with the peach tree, which Lily had informed her was now sleeping for the winter, though it would be back. Addie brought jollof rice and a vegetable stew because James worked a night shift that started at 10 and needed something real in his stomach before he left, and because cooking for people was one of the primary languages in which Addie Webb said what she meant. After dinner, when Lily was in the bath and James was getting ready for his shift, Addie sat at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me what you know about the school's administration." James sat down with his coffee and told her what he knew, which was not extensive. He had been a nursing parent for long enough to have developed the particular tunnel vision of someone managing 2 demanding realities simultaneously. He knew the principal's name and Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Timms and Walter. What about the district level? Addie said, "The people above the principal." James said, "Not much." "Why?" "Because Lily heard something about a restructuring," Addie said. "And I think we should understand what it means before it happens rather than after." James looked at her. She rarely alarmed without cause. He said, "You think it affects Walter?" "I think it might," she said. "And I think someone should be asking questions before the decision is made rather than after." She picked up her mug. "You have a gift for asking the right questions in the right tone. I have watched you use it with physicians who outranked you and with families who were frightened and with hospital administrators who needed to be reminded of things they had decided to forget." She looked at him directly. "This is a smaller situation than any of those." "But it is not a small situation." James said, "What do you want me to do?" "Find out who actually makes these decisions," Addie said. "And then ask them the question that nobody has thought to ask, which is what Walter Grimes actually contributes to that building and what it would cost the school to lose it." James was quiet for a moment. He was a man who thought before he spoke and who, when he decided to act, acted with the completeness of someone who had already worked through the implications. He said, "All right." He found out through a sequence of conversations that took him 3 days and required nothing more remarkable than asking people directly and listening carefully to what they said. Mrs. Timms was the key, which Addie had predicted, because Mrs. Timms knew everything about the school's operational relationships and had a gift for providing information in a form that was technically appropriate and practically comprehensive. She told him that the district's contract management had been taken over by Marsh Education Group 18 months ago. She told him the name Elliot Marsh, and that he had been visiting the building. She said this with the slightly significant emphasis of someone who considers a piece of information relevant and is communicating its relevance through tone rather than statement. James looked up Marsh Education Group that evening. He read the company's stated philosophy carefully, the way he read clinical documentation for what it said and for what it implied. The stated philosophy emphasized institutional culture, the dignity of support staff, operational sustainability over short-term cost reduction. Either this was genuine or it was very good public relations, and the only way to find out which was to engage with the person behind it. He wrote an email. He wrote it with the care he gave to every piece of communication, direct, specific, respectful, without embellishment. He described himself as the father of a student at Maplewood Elementary and said he had a specific question about the facility's contract review that he believed was relevant to the decision-making process. He asked for 15 minutes. He sent it on a Thursday evening. Elliot Marsh's executive assistant responded the following morning with an appointment for the following Tuesday at 4:30. Walter did not know any of this was happening. He was, that same Thursday evening, in his garden at the back of the house on Sycamore Street, doing the last of the fall cleanup, pulling the spent tomato plants, turning the soil, laying the mulch that would protect the beds through the winter. The Cherokee purples were long finished. The last of the peppers had been harvested 2 weeks ago and were sitting in jars of brine in his kitchen. The garden was bare and brown and quietly waiting, the way good ground waited between seasons, not empty but resting, holding what it needed for what came next. He had told Renata about the budget conversation that week. She had been quiet in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how worried to be. She had said, "What do you want to do, Daddy?" He had said he was going to do his job well and let what happened happen. She had said, "And if they cut you?" He had said, "Then I'll figure out the next thing." He was 61 years old. He had a pension that needed 2 more years to vest fully. He had a house that was paid off. He had Curtis and Della and Sunday dinners. He was not, he had told Renata, going to fall apart over this. Renata had said, "I know you're not, but it would be all right if you were a little angry about it." He had thought about that. He had thought about the 31 years of floors he had kept clean in buildings that had never once asked him what he thought about anything. He had thought about the lunch he had eaten alone by the loading dock for 11 years while the cafeteria was full of people 20 feet away. He had thought about the $3.40 pencil sharpener mechanism he had bought with his own money because the alternative was leaving a problem unsolved, and that was something he had never been able to do. He had thought about Lily sitting at table 7 with her lunchbox and the empty seat and the crackers pushed to the center of the table. He had told Renata, "I'm not angry, but I think maybe I've been too quiet for too long." She had said, "What does that mean?" He had said he wasn't sure yet. She had said, "That sounds like the beginning of something." He had gone back to his garden. The meeting between James Osei and Elliot Marsh happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the district municipal building, because Elliot had suggested a neutral location and James had agreed, and because both of them were men who understood that the setting of a conversation shaped what was possible in it. James arrived first and was seated when Elliot came in. He recognized Elliot from the photograph on the company's website, a straightforward headshot, no pretension to it, the kind a person had taken when they needed one and were not particularly interested in managing impressions through photography. Elliot recognized James because he had looked him up after the email, which had been specific and thoughtful in a way that indicated a person worth being specific and thoughtful back to. They shook hands. They ordered coffee. James said, "I'll be direct," because it seemed like the right way to begin, and Elliot said, "Please do." James said, "My daughter is in 2nd grade at Maplewood. Walter Grimes is someone she has developed a real relationship with, and I have come to understand through that relationship that he is considerably more important to that building than his job description reflects." He looked at Elliot. "I'm told there's a budget restructuring being considered that may affect his position. I want to know whether that's accurate, and I want to make sure the people making that decision have the information they need to make it correctly." Elliot looked at him. He said, "How did you hear about the review?" "Children overhear things in hallways," James said, "and then they tell their parents." Elliot said, "Your daughter is Lily." James said, "Yes." Elliot was quiet for a moment. He said, "I was at the family engagement evening. I watched your daughter bring her grandmother and her father across the cafeteria to a facilities display table to introduce them to the school custodian." He paused. "I've been in this business for 12 years and I've never seen that before." James said, "She's been saving him a seat at breakfast since the 1st week of October. She saw him eating alone and she decided that wasn't right." He said it plainly. "That's who she is." Elliot wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said, "I want to tell you something honestly. The proposal that was on the table would have eliminated Walter's position. I pulled it based on my own assessment of what he contributes to that building, which I arrived at through 3 mornings of observation and a conversation with him directly. He paused. But the pressure to find those savings doesn't go away because I pulled one proposal. It reappears in a different form next quarter. He looked at James. What I am trying to build is a different argument. One that demonstrates the actual cost of losing people like Walter rather than just the apparent savings. James said, "What do you need to build that argument?" "Documentation," Elliot said. "Specific, concrete, things that can be put in front of a board and read as operational value rather than sentiment. The things he fixes that nobody tracks. The things he manages that keep problems from becoming crises. The institutional knowledge that exists only in his head and that disappears with him if he leaves." He paused. "I've started compiling it, but I'm one person working from the outside. You're describing someone who has relationships in that building that I don't have access to." James said, "Mrs. Timms has been there almost as long as he has." Elliot said, "I know. I need to talk to her properly. And I need to talk to Walter." James said, "Have you told Walter what you're doing?" "Not completely," Elliot said. "I didn't want to build expectations before I knew whether the argument could be made." He paused. "I think it can be made. But I want to be honest with you. I don't know yet what form the solution takes. I know what I don't want to happen. I'm still working out what should happen instead." James looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who assessed sincerity professionally, who could read the difference between a patient who understood what they were being told and one who was performing understanding. He said, "Lily told me last week that Walter said he wants to stay." Elliot said, "I know he does. I could tell when I talked to him." James said, "She also told me that Walter said he'd been too quiet for too long." He paused. "I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but I think it means something." Elliot said, "I think it does too." They sat together for another 40 minutes. By the end of it, they had the outline of something, not a plan exactly, more the shape of an intention. James would talk to Mrs. Timms. Elliot would return to the building and have a full, direct conversation with Walter. Between them, they would build the documentation that turned what everyone felt about Walter Grimes into something that could survive a spreadsheet. James went home and told Addie. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "Good." Then she said, "Don't tell Lily yet." James said, "Why not?" "Because," Addie said, "if it works, she should see the result without having carried the weight of it. She's 7. She already carries more than she shows. Let her have the good news clean." James looked at his mother-in-law. He said, "When did you get so wise?" She said, "James, I've always been this wise. You just recently started paying full attention." Elliot returned to Maplewood on a Thursday morning. He did not bring a clipboard. He found Walter in the east corridor before the first bell and said, "I need to have a different conversation with you than the one we had before." Walter looked at him. He said, "All right," and they went to the supply room at the end of the hallway, which was the closest thing to private that the building offered at 7:30 in the morning, and Elliot told him directly what he was doing and why. Walter listened without interrupting. Elliot had learned from James that this was how Walter operated, and he let him operate that way. When he finished, Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You pulled the proposal already?" "Yes," Elliot said. Walter said, "But the pressure comes back." "It does," Elliot said. "Which is why I need to build something that holds." Walter looked at him. He said, "What do you need from me?" Elliot said, "I need you to tell me everything you do that isn't in the job description. Everything you've fixed that nobody tracked. Every system you maintain that exists because you built it. Every problem you've solved before it became a crisis and therefore never appeared on anyone's report because a crisis never happened." He paused. "I need the invisible work made visible." Walter looked at the supply room shelves. He had organized them himself 3 years ago, in a system that made sense and that nobody else in the building could interpret without him explaining it. That was one thing right there. He said, "That's going to take more than one conversation." "I know," Elliot said. "Take whatever time you need." Walter said, "Why are you doing this?" He said it without suspicion, but with the directness of a man who believes that people's motivations are relevant information. "My mother worked in a school cafeteria for 22 years, Elliot said. When she retired, 3 things she had been quietly managing fell apart within a semester. Nobody had asked her what she actually did. He looked at Walter. I have spent 12 years trying to build companies that don't make that mistake. Sometimes I don't succeed. He paused. I'm trying to succeed here. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my daughter's a teacher. She'd say the same thing about cafeteria staff. Elliot said, what would she say? That the building runs on the people nobody puts in the brochure, Walter said. Elliot said, that is exactly what I'm trying to prove. So will you help me? Walter said, yes. On one condition. Elliot said, name it. Walter said, you're going to talk to Pete Garrido too. He's been here 4 years. He's not as long-tenured as me and his rate is lower, so he probably looks safer on a spreadsheet. But he's got 2 kids in middle school and he does good work and he shouldn't be cut to protect me. Whatever you build it for both of us. Elliot looked at him. He said, all right. Walter said, good. He pulled the supply room door open. Then he stopped and turned back. That little girl, Lily. Did her father come to see you? Elliot said, yes. Walter absorbed this. He said, she told me most things that seem complicated are just things nobody said out loud yet. Elliot said, she's right. Walter said, she usually is. He went back to work. The documentation took 2 weeks to build properly. Elliot and Mrs. Timms met twice. Long meetings in which she walked him through 11 years of the kind of institutional knowledge that lived in no file cabinet but could be reconstructed through the memory of someone who had been watching closely. The gymnasium window, the pencil sharpeners, the morning arrival routing, the staff bathroom plumbing fix that Walter had improvised from a hardware store visit on his own lunch break, and that had been holding reliably for 2 years. The supply room organization system, the relationships with the vendors who serviced the building's mechanical systems, relationships that Walter had cultivated over years so that when something urgent came up, there was a person on the other end of the phone who picked up. Mrs. Timms provided all of it with the thoroughness of someone releasing something they have been holding for a long time and are relieved to finally put down somewhere it will be properly kept. Pete Garrido was quieter about his contribution, not from reluctance but from the particular self-effacement of someone who had always assumed his work was being counted and was slightly surprised to learn it wasn't. He told Elliot about the boiler room maintenance schedule he had been running informally, about the fire drill compliance tracking he had absorbed into his morning rounds, about the after-school program setups he had been doing 3 times a week for the past year that were listed nowhere in his hours because the program coordinator had asked him as a favor and he had said yes. Elliot built the document over 2 weeks. He built it the way he built everything important, from the ground up with specificity and evidence, because he had learned that sentiment lost arguments and specificity won them. By the time it was finished, it was 14 pages, and it demonstrated with numbers and incident records and work order histories and comparative maintenance costs what 2 experienced custodians contributed to a building over and above their stated scope, and what the real cost of losing them, in deferred maintenance, in crisis repairs, in operational disruption, in the institutional knowledge that could not be replaced by a new hire at a lower rate in any reasonable timeline, actually was. He presented it to his board in the last week of November. Greg Paulson read it with the expression of someone encountering a methodology he had not considered and was not entirely comfortable acknowledging he had not considered. He said, this is a different framing than the standard cost model. Elliot said, yes, it is. He said, the standard cost model counts what we spend. This model counts what we'd spend if we lost it. Those are different numbers. He let the board work through the 14 pages. He had learned over 12 years of these meetings that silence during a review was more effective than commentary. Let the document speak. Let people arrive at the conclusion as though they were arriving at it themselves. The conclusion was sturdier that way. Sandra Fielding, who had been invited to observe, caught his eye at one point during the review. Her expression said she had read the document already and had formed an opinion of it. The opinion was positive. The board approved the revised approach unanimously. The Maplewood reduction was not reinstated. Pete Garrido's position was not restructured. In fact, the board approved a modest reclassification of both positions, not a large increase, but a real one, with a title adjustment that reflected actual scope and a formal role for Walter in the district's Facility Knowledge Documentation Initiative, which was Elliot's way of making sure that what lived in Walter's head was systematically recorded before it could disappear. Elliot called James that evening. He said it held. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, thank you. Elliot said, thank Lily. James said, I plan to. Elliot said, "I'd like to meet with Walter directly to tell him." James said, "He deserves to hear it from you." Elliot said, "I know. I'm going to the building tomorrow morning." James said, "What time?" Elliot said, 7:30. James said, "Lily will be at table 7 at 7:42. There was a pause. Then Elliot said, "Maybe I should arrive a little later." James said, "Maybe you should." The morning Elliot Marsh walked into the cafeteria at Maplewood Elementary and sat down at table 7. It was the first Friday in December, and the building smelled of cinnamon from some holiday project happening in the second grade wing, and the radiators were doing their November performance along the east wall, and the fluorescent tube above row 3 was buzzing its particular frequency, and for the first time in 11 years it did not give Walter Grimes a headache at all. He was already at the table when Elliot arrived. Lily was across from him, the thermos of Addie's hot chocolate between them, the crackers in their row along the center of the table. She looked up when Elliot sat down at the end of their table, and she looked at him with her mother's direct, assessing gaze, and then she looked at Walter, and something moved through her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone seeing a thing they had somehow expected without knowing they were expecting it. Walter said, "Lily, this is Elliot Marsh. He's the person I told you about. The one who's been looking at the building." Lily looked at Elliot. She said, "Are you the one who decides if Walter stays?" Elliot said, "I'm one of the people involved in that decision." She said, "Have you decided?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And?" Elliot looked at Walter. He said, "Walter stays, and Pete stays, and the work they do is going to be properly recognized going forward instead of being invisible." He paused. "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to look at it correctly." Walter was quiet for a moment. 11 years is a long time to be quiet, he said. "I know," Elliot said. "I'm going to try to make sure the next 11 are different." He paused. "I'd like to talk through the details with you separately. There's a formal role in a documentation initiative that I think makes sense for you, if you're interested. But I didn't want to have that conversation until I said this part first, in person, directly. You were going to be cut because someone was looking at the wrong number. I looked at the right ones." He held Walter's gaze. "You deserve to know that what you do here matters and has been seen." Walter looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Lily, who was watching him with the complete, patient attention of someone who has waited for something and is now receiving it and wants to be fully present for it. He said, "You know, I've been telling Lily here that things are more complicated than they look." He almost smiled. "She keeps telling me they're just things that nobody has said out loud yet." Elliot said, "She's right." Walter looked at Lily. "I think I've been too quiet for a long time," he said. "About a lot of things." Lily pushed the crackers toward Elliot's side of the table. She said, "Here. There's enough." Elliot looked at the crackers. He looked at the thermos. He looked at this small, serious girl in her yellow cardigan, and the old man beside her, who had eaten alone by a loading dock for 11 years before a 7-year-old decided that wasn't right. He said, "Thank you, Lily." She said, "You're welcome." She said it the way her grandmother said things, plainly, without ceremony, as though welcome was a fact and not a courtesy. Then she poured him a cup of hot chocolate and pushed it across the table and went back to her crackers, and the three of them sat together at table 7 while the cafeteria filled up around them and the morning bell moved closer and the December light came through the windows at a low winter angle and made everything in the room look, briefly, like something worth keeping. There were people who would learn about this later and want to make it into more than it was, and there were people who would learn about it and want to make it into less. The truth was somewhere in between and also simply itself, which was that a child had noticed something and done something about it, and a chain of small, specific actions had followed, each one requiring nothing more remarkable than a person deciding to look at the right thing and say what they saw. But that was not quite the end of it. James Osei did not know, when he wrote the email to Elliot Marsh, that Elliot Marsh had been looking for something at Maplewood for reasons that were not only about cost restructuring. He had been looking with the particular eye of someone who had built a company on a set of values and needed to know whether those values were actually shaping what his company touched or were simply things he said in speeches and believed in an abstract way that cost him nothing specific, for evidence that the work he was doing was real. He had built Marsh Education Group because of his mother. He had told Walter this. What he had not told Walter, because it was not the right moment, was that his mother had spent 22 years in a school cafeteria and then spent 3 years being sick in a way that had required the particular full presence of someone close who could advocate for her, interpret what the doctors were saying, manage the systems that patients could not manage for themselves, and that he had not been as present as he should have been in those 3 years because he had been building his company and believed that building his company was the best way to honor her legacy, and that this belief, though not entirely wrong, had also been convenient in a way he had only understood after she was gone. He carried this. He carried it the way people carry the specific weight of love expressed too late in the form it needed to take, which is not as a wound exactly but as a permanent knowing, a thing you have learned about yourself that you cannot unlearn and that you must therefore do something with or let it become merely a grief. He was trying to do something with it. The documentation project, the revised methodology, the formal recognition for Walter and Pete, these were not small things. But they were also not, he knew, the whole answer. The whole answer was something he was still working toward, still building the shape of in the part of his mind where he kept the things that mattered most and worked on them steadily and without announcing them until they were ready. Lily Osei did not know any of this. She knew that Walter was staying and that the crackers were running low and that the bell was about to ring. She knew that the man named Elliot had warm eyes and had said sorry to Walter in the direct, specific way of someone who meant it, and that Walter had looked at him the way Walter looked at things he had decided to trust, which was steadily and without performance. She gathered her things. She stood up. She looked at Walter. "Same time Monday?" she said. Walter said, "Same time Monday." She looked at Elliot. "You can come too," she said, "if you want. We have crackers usually." Elliot looked at her. He said, "I'd like that very much." She nodded, satisfied, and walked toward the hallway and her second-grade classroom where Mrs. Abernathy was waiting and the Migratory Birds project was nearly finished and 12 children who were, by now, no longer quite as unfamiliar as they had been in September were waiting for her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Walter watched her go. He said to Elliot, the first morning she sat down, "I didn't know what to do with it." Elliot said, "What did you do?" "I sat down," Walter said. Elliot said, "That was the right call." Walter said, "Usually is." He picked up his mop cart. "Lot of floor between here and the gymnasium," he said. Elliot said, "I'll let you work." Walter released the brake on the cart. Then he stopped. He said, "Elliot." Elliot looked at him. "Thank you," Walter said, "for looking at the right numbers." Elliot said, "Thank your daughter." Walter said, "She's not my daughter. But I think she might be the best thing that happened in this building in 11 years. He pushed the cart toward the gymnasium corridor. Elliot sat at table 7 for another moment after he was gone, alone in the thinning crowd of breakfast children, and thought about his mother in her cafeteria for 22 years, and about a bench in a bus terminal in a city he had not been back to since he was a boy, and about the particular gravity of small moments that accumulate, without announcement, into the whole weight of a life. He finished the hot chocolate Lily had poured him. It was, as Addie had promised, the real kind. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. He said, "I need to schedule something for next week." She said, "Of course, what is it?" He said, "I need to go see someone. Someone I should have seen more often." She said, "I'll find the time." He said, "Thank you," and sat for one more moment at table 7, in the December light, in the warm smell of cinnamon and coffee and old floors kept clean, before he stood and put on his coat and walked out into the morning. The someone Elliot needed to see was not in Clover Hill. She was in Winston-Salem, in a small assisted living facility called Bridgewater Gardens, which had cream-colored walls and a dining room that smelled like institutional coffee and something trying to be flowers, and which his mother, Clara Marsh, had moved into 8 months ago after a fall in her kitchen that had resulted in a hairline fracture in her left hip and a conversation between Elliot and her doctor that had gone the way those conversations go when a man has been telling himself for 2 years that his mother is fine because she tells him she is fine, and he has found it convenient to believe her. Clara Marsh was 79 years old. She was small and sharp and had her son's eyes and her own way of looking at the world, which was directly and without sentimentality, and with the precise warmth of someone who had learned that warmth and clarity were not opposites but companions. She had done this with Elliot his entire life. She had told him the truth about his father, who left when Elliot was 9, in terms a 9-year-old could carry without being crushed. She had told him the truth about money in terms that made it a problem to be solved rather than a source of shame. She had told him the truth about his first business idea, which was not good, and his second, which was better, and his third, and she had been right about all 3 assessments. She had also told him the truth about the last 3 years, in the indirect way of a woman who believed some truths were better offered as weather reports than confrontations. Mentioning in passing that the drive to the grocery store felt longer than it used to, that the hip had been bothering her more than she let on, that the house felt a little big in the evenings. Elliot had heard all of it and absorbed it into the part of his mind where he kept things he intended to address when the timing was better. The timing had never been better. The fall in the kitchen had made the timing irrelevant. He drove to Winston-Salem on a Saturday morning in early December. He had called the facilities care coordinator, a woman named Ruth, rather than Clara, because calling Clara ahead meant she would spend the intervening time performing fineness and he would spend the visit watching the performance rather than seeing what was actually there. Ruth told him his mother was stable, that her vitals were good, that she had made a friend named Dorothy who sat with her at dinner. She also told him, in the same tone, that his mother mentioned him every day and that visits were the single most effective thing family could do for a resident's well-being, and that he should come as often as he could manage. He had come 4 times in 8 months. He was not going to pretend that was enough. Clara was in the common room when he arrived, seated near the window with a book open on her lap that she was not reading, looking out at the small garden, which in December held nothing but bare rose bushes and a stone birdbath with an inch of ice across the top. She looked older than September, and he understood with the particular vertigo of someone who has not been watching closely that she had probably looked this way in September too, and he had not let himself see it. She looked up when he came in. Her face moved through surprise, then something that held hurt and joy in the same breath, then the warm, clear expression that had always been her resting state when she was with him. "Elliot," she said. He sat across from her and took her hands in both of his. He said, "Hi, Mama." She said, "You look tired." He said, "I've been working on something." She said, "You're always working on something." She squeezed his hands. "But you came." He said, "I should have come sooner." She looked at him with the patience of a woman who had decided not to spend the good parts of the visit on the harder parts. She said, "You're here now. Tell me what you've been working on." He told her about Maplewood. He told her about the morning in the cafeteria, about Walter at table 7, about the budget proposal and what he had done with it. He told her about Lily, the crackers, the hot chocolate, the saved seat, the 7-year-old who had noticed a man eating alone and simply decided to do something about it. Clara listened with both hands still in his, fully present in the way she had always been fully present, and her expression moved through the story without holding anything back. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "She sounds like somebody." Elliot said, "She reminded me of you. The way she just did it. No announcement. No calculation. She saw something that needed doing and she did it." Clara said, "That's not special. That's just correct." He said, "I know. But not everybody does it." She said, "No. Not everybody does." She looked out the window at the frozen birdbath. She said, 22 years in that cafeteria and I knew every child who came through my line. I knew who was having a bad week. I knew who wasn't eating at home and needed an extra roll without making it a thing." She paused. "Nobody ever asked me what I knew. When I left, it went with me." Elliot said, "I know, Mama." He said it the way he said. City he had not been back to since he was a boy, and about the particular gravity of small moments that accumulate, without announcement, into the whole weight of a life. He finished the hot chocolate Lily had poured him. It was, as Addie had promised, the real kind. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. He said, "I need to schedule something for next week." She said, "Of course, what is it?" He said, "I need to go see someone. Someone I should have seen more often." She said, "I'll find the time." He said, "Thank you," and sat for one more moment at table 7, in the December light, in the warm smell of cinnamon and coffee and old floors kept clean, before he stood and put on his coat and walked out into the morning. The someone Elliot needed to see was not in Clover Hill. She was in Winston-Salem, in a small assisted living facility called Bridgewater Gardens, which had cream-colored walls and a dining room that smelled like institutional coffee and something trying to be flowers, and which his mother, Clara Marsh, had moved into 8 months ago after a fall in her kitchen that had resulted in a hairline fracture in her left hip and a conversation between Elliot and her doctor that had gone the way those conversations go when a man has been telling himself for 2 years that his mother is fine because she tells him she is fine, and he has found it convenient to believe her. Clara Marsh was 79 years old. She was small and sharp and had her son's eyes and her own way of looking at the world, which was directly and without sentimentality, and with the precise warmth of someone who had learned that warmth and clarity were not opposites but companions. She had done this with Elliot his entire life. She had told him the truth about his father, who left when Elliot was 9, in terms a 9-year-old could carry without being crushed. She had told him the truth about money in terms that made it a problem to be solved rather than a source of shame. She had told him the truth about his first business idea, which was not good, and his second, which was better, and his third, and she had been right about all 3 assessments. She had also told him the truth about the last 3 years, in the indirect way of a woman who believed some truths were better offered as weather reports than confrontations. Mentioning in passing that the drive to the grocery store felt longer than it used to, that the hip had been bothering her more than she let on, that the house felt a little big in the evenings. Elliot had heard all of it and absorbed it into the part of his mind where he kept things he intended to address when the timing was better. The timing had never been better. The fall in the kitchen had made the timing irrelevant. He drove to Winston-Salem on a Saturday morning in early December. He had called the facilities care coordinator, a woman named Ruth, rather than Clara, because calling Clara ahead meant she would spend the intervening time performing fineness and he would spend the visit watching the performance rather than seeing what was actually there. Ruth told him his mother was stable, that her vitals were good, that she had made a friend named Dorothy who sat with her at dinner. She also told him, in the same tone, that his mother mentioned him every day and that visits were the single most effective thing family could do for a resident's well-being, and that he should come as often as he could manage. He had come 4 times in 8 months. He was not going to pretend that was enough. Clara was in the common room when he arrived, seated near the window with a book open on her lap that she was not reading, looking out at the small garden, which in December held nothing but bare rose bushes and a stone birdbath with an inch of ice across the top. She looked older than September, and he understood with the particular vertigo of someone who has not been watching closely that she had probably looked this way in September too, and he had not let himself see it. She looked up when he came in. Her face moved through surprise, then something that held hurt and joy in the same breath, then the warm, clear expression that had always been her resting state when she was with him. "Elliot," she said. He sat across from her and took her hands in both of his. He said, "Hi, Mama." She said, "You look tired." He said, "I've been working on something." She said, "You're always working on something." She squeezed his hands. "But you came." He said, "I should have come sooner." She looked at him with the patience of a woman who had decided not to spend the good parts of the visit on the harder parts. She said, "You're here now. Tell me what you've been working on." He told her about Maplewood. He told her about the morning in the cafeteria, about Walter at table 7, about the budget proposal and what he had done with it. He told her about Lily, the crackers, the hot chocolate, the saved seat, the 7-year-old who had noticed a man eating alone and simply decided to do something about it. Clara listened with both hands still in his, fully present in the way she had always been fully present, and her expression moved through the story without holding anything back. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "She sounds like somebody." Elliot said, "She reminded me of you. The way she just did it. No announcement. No calculation. She saw something that needed doing and she did it." Clara said, "That's not special. That's just correct." He said, "I know. But not everybody does it." She said, "No. Not everybody does." She looked out the window at the frozen birdbath. She said, 22 years in that cafeteria and I knew every child who came through my line. I knew who was having a bad week. I knew who wasn't eating at home and needed an extra roll without making it a thing." She paused. "Nobody ever asked me what I knew. When I left, it went with me." Elliot said, "I know, Mama." He said it the way he said. Across all district facilities, a quarterly acknowledgement of support staff whose contributions exceeded their documented scope, nominated by colleagues and community members, recognized with a financial award and a formal entry in the district's operational record. He named it the Invisible Work Award. He sent a memo. He did not make a speech. Walter Grimes was the first recipient. The notification arrived in an envelope left on his cart by Mrs. Timms, who had been asked to deliver it personally, and who had done so with the expression of someone exercising great restraint about how pleased she was. Walter opened it in the supply room, standing between the shelves he had organized 3 years ago in the system that made sense, and he read it twice and folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt, next to the crayon drawing of Walter and Lily's table with the 5-pointed stars in each corner that he had carried there since October. He called Renata that evening. She answered on the second ring. He told her about the award. She was quiet in the recognizing way. Then she said, "Daddy." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm glad." He said, "Me too." She said, "What are you going to do with it?" He said, "Put it somewhere I can see it." She said, "Good." They talked about the garden after that. The Cherokee purples had gone in 2 weeks ago. He was cautiously optimistic about August. She said she wanted to come visit. He said, "Come before August." She said she would. On the last day of school in June, Lily set a small package on the table in front of Walter. He looked at it. She said, "Open it." It was a seed packet. Cherokee purple tomato seeds with a hand-drawn label that said, "To Walter, so you always have more." She had drawn a tomato in each corner, round and careful. He held it in both hands. He said, "Did Nana Addie help you pick this?" She said, "I asked her what your favorite kind was." She said, "Cherokee purple." She said, "You'd understand." He looked at her. He said, "I understand." She said, "Good." She climbed off the bench and picked up her backpack. She said, "I'll be in 3rd grade in September." He said, "I know." She said, "I'll still come to table 7. He said, "I'll be here." She said, "I know." She walked toward the hallway and did not look back, which was not indifference but its opposite, the complete security of someone who does not need to check because she already knows the thing is there. Walter watched the door she had walked through. Then he looked down at the seed packet in his hands. Cherokee purple. So you always have more. He thought about the loading dock. He thought about 11 years of lunches eaten alone in the accepted quiet of a man who had decided that was simply how things were. He thought about a small girl in a yellow cardigan sitting at an empty table with her hands folded and a seat saved and crackers pushed to the center, waiting with the complete patience of someone who had decided that no one should have to eat alone, and that this was not a remarkable decision but simply a correct one. He put the seed packet in his breast pocket. He picked up his mop cart. He released the brake. He went back to work. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.